All right, so in our last lecture, we went through cultural requirements, plant cultural requirements. We had already gone through to some degree nutrient requirements, relatively lightweight on that, but we're good. In the last lecture, though, we went through climate and temperature. And those are really, really, really key elements to take into consideration in horticulture for obvious reasons. In the landscape world, we are always looking for plants that are adapted well enough to be able to survive and ideally thrive with minimal inputs in the region, location, or climate that they are being put into, right? So we wouldn't take a plant that grows in the South American rainforest and put it into Palm Springs, right? I'm not going to say that that doesn't happen, but when we do that, we really need to baby that plant in order to get it to just survive. And generally, it will never truly thrive. But you have to put so many inputs into it to get that plant to be able to somehow live in that environment that it did not evolve and adapt to. It evolved and adapted to high humidity, lots of water, moderate to lower high temperatures, rich soils, zero freezing conditions, generally never instances where there's low levels of humidity with really high temperatures, right? So if you take a plant from the Amazon and you throw it into Palm Springs, then in order, like it's possible, and again, we see it happen, but the amount of inputs that you need to throw into that plant in order to get it to thrive and survive, or not thrive, just to survive, it becomes A, expensive, and B, it becomes sort of a daunting task to have that plant there. And that plant is outrageously prone to pests and diseases because it's constantly in a state of stress. So that's an extreme example of why in the landscape world, when we're selecting plants to be planted at a location that is part of a larger geographic climate, that we're honoring that climate so that those plants can thrive and survive with minimal inputs. And we talked about the Mediterranean climate that we live in and the fact that in the summertime, many plants, actually, the majority of plants in landscapes, unless we're selecting outrageously wisely, which we should be doing, but doesn't happen currently, we have to irrigate in the summertime, right? Typically on the shoulder seasons as well, but we need that supplemental irrigation. And there's some pros and cons to that, but that's the landscape world, honoring the climate that you're in, selecting plants that are adapted to living in those climates in a very healthy way. Now, there's other areas of the horticultural world, right? We talked about the landscape world. There's the greenhouse production world. There's the floriculture world, right? And there's a lot of other areas of horticulture that aren't associated with planting landscapes. Generally, they're associated with growing plants for sale, and whether that's for sale in a retail nursery setting, a wholesale nursery setting, or a mail order setting, or simply for producing food in a controlled environment, right? So the greenhouse world is really that area where we're trying our best. We're doing things to be able to control the climate. And we use greenhouse structures to do that. We use climate control within those structures to do that, and we use automation to do that. And we use every level of that. So we can have a greenhouse with zero climate control and zero automation. And there are a lot of really good productive greenhouses that have zero climate control and zero automation. They're generally located in regions that can deal with that, or regions that have some sort of special characteristics to them that that allow plants to grow without significant amounts of climate control and automation. Okay. So we're going to go through what types of greenhouse designs there are, and there's a lot. Generally, though, right now, especially, the majority of greenhouses that are getting built are clearly for production and profit. And so along with that production and profit, they need to invest in a greenhouse that has all of these things, right? They have climate control, they have automation, as well as a lot of other whistles and bells. But there's a lot of really classic greenhouses that aren't necessarily for production and profit. They're for pure enjoyment, or for those plant nerds like us out there that just want to have an area to be able to put all of their orchids or all of their whatever they're growing. Okay, so we're going to look at those. We're going to look at different types of greenhouse glazing materials. And glazing materials are the materials that go on the outside of the greenhouse. Typically, they're translucent or completely transparent. And some of them are better at holding in heat and than others. Some of them are incredibly more expensive than others, et cetera. So we're going to look at those. We'll look at different types of environmental controls. How do we control heat? How do we control cool? How do we control humidity? All of those things. How greenhouses are heated and cooled, and then the automation systems themselves. So what are the different types of greenhouse designs? Greenhouse is a structure enclosed by a translucent material in which plants are grown. That's just what they are. They allow light in, but serve as a barrier between the inside and the outside environments. That is modifying the climate. And they give a grower control over these environmental factors inside the structure that they don't have control of outside of the structure. First one we'll look at is the very simple classic lean-to greenhouse. It's attached to a building. Okay, it's a lean-to. Okay, it's essentially leaning up against some other structure. The building itself provides the support for the roof on the greenhouse. Structurally, it's expensive to provide support. And so if you already have something that you can support something off of, then it's less expensive to do. And generally, these are placed on the south side of the building to maximize sunlight. Okay, so we're maximizing sunlight. You may find them sometimes on a different side of the building. Southern exposure in the northern hemisphere is the hottest side, the most full sun side of a building. But you may be growing plants for other purposes, right? You may not be growing sun-loving plants. You may be growing shade-loving plants, and you may want this on the east side of the building, which generally gets morning sun, which is the cooler portion of the day. So sunlight during the cooler portion of the day. And then shade in the afternoon. Or you may want it even on the north side of a building. But generally, south and west facing sides of the building are the sunniest and the hottest portions, locations around a building. And then the north and the east side of buildings are generally the coolest with the lowest amount of sunlight or damaging portion of the day's sunlight, respectively. Certainly the north side, that's for sure. So lean-to greenhouse. Simple structures, you see these a lot, and these are generally installed for the horticultural hobbyist. Even span greenhouses, they have roofs with an even pitch and an even width. Okay, so this one, you can see that there's an even width. So you've got a center line on it, an even pitch to the roof on both sides, and then an even width from that center line to each side. And these are single houses, a single greenhouse. Hoop houses are a little bit different than the rest of the ones that we're talking about in this lecture. Hoop houses are probably the lowest cost greenhouse structure that you can install. And essentially, it's installed using arching pipes as the framework. So from here up around to here, it's just an arching pipe, generally with some sort of securing pipe that goes between it. And when I say pipe, I literally mean pipe. You sometimes see these built with simple PVC pipe. It's not to run water through, it's just to provide structure. Most of the time, though, it's used, generally the piping that's used for it is really similar to steel electrical conduit piping, where it's a steel material that's sturdy. You can drill into it. It doesn't typically doesn't crack. It can rust out, but it's an inexpensive material. And then afterwards, when we talk about glazing, we'll go through how they actually, get the glazing on this. And you can see that this is actually just plastic sheets that's on it. So very low cost. They're pretty much always even span. I've never seen one not even span, but very good, inexpensive way to, excuse me, and fast way to get climate control, where you really don't even need a foundation. You just need to construct this and try to seal it in as best you can. Uneven span greenhouses, they have roofs with unequal pitch and width. Generally, it's limited to hillsides. And it's rare that these are built today because it's really tough to get effective automation into it because there's two different heights of wall, and it becomes more and more complicated to get automation and climate control into it. In this one, you can see, and we'll talk about this more later, you can see that this one just has simple ventilation. Now, there are systems, and when we talk about heating, there are some regions that do pretty much all passive solar heating of their greenhouses, and it's sort of a combination of what they do is a bit of a combination between a lean-to and a uneven span greenhouse. Now, the reason that they do it this way is that essentially there ends up being some reflected heat off of the structure that it's leaning up against. And when it's not built as a lean-to up against an existing structure as sort of an auxiliary structure, if the main intent is greenhouse for this build and there's nothing there, a lot of times what you'll see is that this is the south-facing side, and then the material that is on the north side of the structure, so on the outside, as I'm pointing to this, the material that makes up that wall will reflect heat into the structure itself. There's a lot of these in China and a couple other regions. It's if you have the space and you're on a slope and you need some retention and you're south facing, it can actually be a pretty effective way to do it. But in the United States, in California, it's very rare to see this. Ridge and furrow greenhouses, and I'm going to zip over to this, right? This is a ridge and furrow. Okay, there's just a little too much to say here, so I didn't put the picture on it. This is a ridge and furrow, and essentially it's a number of greenhouse structures that are joined together along the length of the houses. So the short portion if we consider this a single house here, the short portion or the gabled end of it is not the attached part. It's the long wall, the long leg of the rectangle is what the shared portion is. Now, essentially, the reason for building greenhouses in this fashion is that it's a very effective way to do a series of greenhouse structures where there is shared walls, which essentially means that you don't need glazing on these walls. So it's a significant savings in terms of the build out of that project. And the other benefit to that, in addition to saving some money on not having to glaze this side of the greenhouse, is that, and as I'm doing this, and when I'm saying this side of the greenhouse, I'm really saying like this whole portion, but on the opposite side of the building, right? So in addition to like some cost savings, it also opens up a huge interior space for growing. It ends up being lower in heating costs because instead of having a singular even pitched greenhouse that you have to have a heater in and all the other elements in it, in each one of these, you could have one heater for every 2 or 3 of these even pitched greenhouses that have the shared wall. And so you're reducing your install costs there, your initial costs, the capital investment. Gutters, the reason it's called ridge and furrow greenhouses, so there's a ridge and a furrow, so a lot like a sloping furrow crop system. There's ridge and furrow, and at the furrows you have a gutter, essentially because it's going to rain on this and you need to get that water to go somewhere. So in this valley, right, that heads through between these two portions of the greenhouse structure, there's a gutter in there so that we remove any excess water. That being said, there's a gutter there that is not translucent. It's something that's going to collect water, and it's not something that you're going to want to spend a bunch of money on, you know, clear polyethylene pipes or something. So that is a shading point of the greenhouse. And so these are typically oriented north to south, so that as the sun comes over it from east to west, that shading point transitions across the growing surface, right? So you don't end up with like an area, if they were oriented east to west, then you would have a strip that's constantly shaded within these. Okay, so that's the way that they're oriented. So when you're out and about, just look, I'm sure that you've seen greenhouses out and about traveling. Certainly you see a lot of them in Southern California. You see several of them across 80. So just as you're out and about, if you notice greenhouses out there, take a look at them and see which way they're oriented, which type they are, etc. These are really widely used because you can group the automation to it. So you can have several sensors throughout, and then you can have one automation control system that can control the entire interior. I think that's about it on this one. I think I went through everything. So jumping back here, it consists of a number of structures joined together along the length of the houses. Shared sidewalls are eliminated to create a large interior space. There's lower heating costs. Gutters are installed to remove the water. They're oriented north to south. Eliminates permanent shadows at gutters if they were oriented otherwise. Widely used in automation, automated operations. Higher gutters create better air circulation, cooler summer temps at bench level. Okay, so those are the basic types. We've got lean-tos, even spans, hoop houses, uneven span, and then ridge and furrow. and there's a fair amount more, but generally it's some sort of modification of one of these types. Now, the framework that's used for it, we went through, lightly went through the greenhouse framework. The intention of the framework is that it supports that glazing material or the covering material. It should be strong without creating shade. Okay, so it needs to be strong enough to hold the glazing material and the structure itself and not get damaged in any kind of excessive wind situations. But it should be made of a material that gains its strength through the material itself, not the girth of the material. That being said, wood has some good structural characteristics to it, but in order to get better structure out of it, you need larger members. So generally, aluminum and aluminum steel combinations are used in constructing the framework of greenhouses because they have high strength at low sizing, right? Like a 1-inch by 1-inch tube steel, depending on the gauge of it, is less, is not as heavy as other materials. And certainly that's why aluminum is used, because structurally it's a pretty strong material, but it's a very light metal, okay? So different parts of that framework here, going through this, we see sidewall or curtain wall. This number 1, this is that sidewall or curtain wall. So referring back to the ridge and furrow system, this is a sidewall or curtain wall, and then a shared sidewall or curtain wall, shared. Here we see a lower side sash through here. Okay, so in these ones, there's no true curtain wall. The glazing goes basically all the way down to the ground. In this example, which is similar to the uneven span, right? This is a curtain wall. Here, side sash. Side vent. So you see this side vent here. This is to allow air in. Okay, typically air in this direction. Of course, air can get out, but when we get to this one is a ridge vent. This is typically to allow air, hot air to escape. Okay, allows hot air to escape. Number 4 is a transom sill. So that's the sill that is between the side vent and the lower side sash, transom sill. We have a side post. Okay, so simple posts. Sometimes the curtain wall comes across, but there's always posts at side. So side post, side post, side post. There's the connecting piece, which is a splice plate in this configuration. 7, we've got the rafter. Okay, so this right here is a rafter. And these are all terms that are widely used in building construction as well. These are the rafters of a structure. Typically, you would have some rafter tails in a normal inhabitable structure. This is just the terminology for the framework and portions of a greenhouse. 8, we've got a column. Okay, so this column is a structural column that helps to support the span that the rafter has to make. We've got a cross tie that's another structural element so that it can hold up this roof. So this column meets at the middle of the rafter for support. And then this cross tie ties these together so that it won't rack side to side. Now, why we have all of these elements in here. You could eliminate some of these elements, but the result would be that this rafter would have to be really large. The reason we don't want really large members there is because it's going to block the sun. 10 is a purlin. Okay, so this is I guess similar to a joist in a structure. Sash bars, okay, and a lot of times this is either to their size, the spacing on these is sized so that whatever type of glazing material goes on this slides right into these. We have a header here. This is a ridge vent header, so that when this ridge vent closes, it seals along that header. Again, we have the ridge vent that allows air, hot air to escape. We've just got the ridge cap, which I think, you know, you could liken it to a beam in a normal structure. And that's about it. I mean, the rest of these are relatively no-brainer, but these are all the basic parts of the structure of a greenhouse. And we can relate these to a ridge and furrow system. Okay, you see that there's the side post, you see a column, you see a cross brace, you see a ridge vent header, you see the ridge vent, ridge cap up top. Now let's talk about glazing materials. Different types of glazing materials. When we're considering this, all of the materials need to be durable. They need to allow for light transmission. We're taking into account cost and heat loss. Okay, so glazing materials that are very durable transmit the required amount of light, right? Some crops that we grow, we want to be able to grow in really high levels of light. Some crops that we grow, we may want to grow in lower levels of light. And there's some ways that we can modify that as well, with some curtains and some other things. So we're weighing out all of these things: durability, light transmission, and heat loss against the cost, right? Glazing materials that are very durable have high levels of light transmission and low levels of heat loss cost more. Materials that are less durable have lower levels of light transmission and high levels of heat loss cost less. Okay, so you have to weigh that out against what kind of capital investment you're making. The first one we're looking at is polyethylene. So this is the hoop house situation where there's the pipes that go up and over, and essentially you're covering this with 6 millimeter thick polyethylene sheets that are stretched over the framework. These are really widely used and inexpensive. They don't have very good light transmission, which can be great for a lot of crops. And they aren't very durable, but they're really inexpensive, and you don't need specialized labor to replace the coverings, right? You build the framework, you utilize these sheets for a number of seasons. When the sheets are done and you've patched them enough times, you replace the sheets, and it's not a crazy investment. Okay, so those are the things you need to weigh out. Now, one of the cool things that they do, because the polyethylene has really high heat loss, is that they'll double these up. So they'll put one up and then another one outside of that, and then they'll blow air in between it to create a separation between the outside environment and the inside environment. And what that does is it does a bit of insulation to be able to retain heat. And it does say here, heating costs are a third of the cost of a glass covered house. Now, glass covered houses are super expensive. They're rarely used except for typically in conservatory situations where it's a very, in botanical gardens, a very like public and pretty setting, or in private settings, not typically used for commercial production. Okay. But using this double layer actually reduces the heating costs. And you know, the glass houses, they're pretty, they're nostalgic, but glass has a really terrible, unless you use really expensive glass, which you don't want to do in these situations because the capital investment's so high and throws off the, you know, the profit mark. Um, uh, uh, so the heat loss through glass is really high. Disadvantages to polyethylene. It's not durable because it breaks down, and the UV light breaks down the plastics. Typically, it's replaced every 3 to 4 years. And one layer cuts light by 70 to 75%. Two layers reduces light by 85 to 90%. Okay, so that's a disadvantage. You need to be careful about what you're actually growing in there. Typically, you're growing things that are more shade loving or can thrive and really grow in lower light conditions. So the types of crops that are produced in these hoop houses using polyethylene are limited. And especially once you get in Northern California, right? In the northern areas, it becomes more limiting. Southern California, more moderate winter temperatures, it can you can get away with it much easier. The growing environment itself is pretty small, and it can cause really high humidity levels because it's completely covered, right? You only have end ventilation. Typically, you don't have side ventilation on these. And if we can zip back to this, you can see that the growing, like the area that you have to grow, is pretty tight because of the curve structure itself. And due to the high humidity levels, you can end up with some issues like botrytis or any kind of other, you can end up with fungal diseases and botrytis and et cetera that are inherent in high humidity situations. Polycarbonate structures, so polycarbonate structured sheets, or PSS, these are the most widely used. Okay, so generally you're going to see these on any new greenhouse builds or remodels. They're manufactured with a twin wall held together by ribs. There you go. So twin wall with ribs. Looks like hollow tubes side by side running the length of the sheet itself. The tubing effect provides insulation and cuts heating costs. So a lot like that double layer of polyethylene, you've got a double layer, and so you have an insulating layer that's between it. And it can be treated with UV light inhibitors and are guaranteed for 10 years. Okay, so you got to weigh this out. They're guaranteed for 10 years, great. They'll probably last a little bit longer than that, but within 10 to 20 years, you're going to have to replace the glazing on this. So you got to weigh it against the flexibility of the structure and the space within it itself, against the 3 to 4 year replacement of these polyethylene sheets. So these, sorry, I jumped ahead there. So generally you get up to 80% light transmission through these, and you can see that there's, different levels, right? There's different thicknesses. So a thicker polycarbonate structured sheet is going to have better insulating qualities. And then they can treat these. You can get these with different. You can get these with different light transmission. Okay, so they're treated so that you can actually, if depending on the crop that you're growing, if you're in a really sunny location and you need to knock down the amount of light, you select a polycarbonate structured sheet that has some sort of inhibitor in it to reduce the amount of light. Nice thing is that they are resistant to hail damage, not resistant to hail damage. Excuse me. Used widely through hail belt areas, Colorado to Texas. Easy to work with and flexible. They can be bent around hoop greenhouses, and they can be easily cut. They're fire resistant, but they're very expensive. There's also acrylic structured sheets. These are made with twin walls like polycarbonate. They have good insulation, high light transmission. They last 8 to 10 years. They cost more than polycarbonate, and they're less flexible than polycarbonate and more prone to hail damage. So this isn't something that you would use in the hail belt, Colorado to Texas. And typically you have less flexibility with these, so you wouldn't be able to use them in a hoop house situation. They need to be straight sheets. There's fiberglass. This was widely used in 50s, 60s, 70s. I think like a lot of people, like there's this nostalgic piece of this that, my uncle's greenhouse, had this corrugated fiberglass on it. They do last 7 to 10 years. They are damaged by, they're not very structural, so they are damaged by heavy hail. Super flammable and horrible insulation, right? So this would land on the not quite as expensive side of things, but you're giving up insulation, flammability, and potential damage. Finally, we alluded to it a couple times, but glass greenhouses, they're considered the best for plant production because of how translucent they are. So high light transmission of 88 to 89%. Panes of glass overlap each other at openings to allow for air exchange. The initial cost is really expensive, but the high advantage of it is it's incredibly long lasting, as long as you don't break it. And over the long term, it can prove to be less expensive or less costly than other coverings because of the really long life of it, but it's incredibly expensive and it breaks. So there's that. Disadvantages are it's breakable. If you're in an area with hail, you do have to buy hail and crop insurance. You can use tempered glass, which is stronger, withstands hail better, but way more expensive. The strength of the material itself allows for much larger spans. So back to this structure, right, where you have all this structural framework, with a glass house, because this glass can be structural itself, you can get much more expansive areas with less shading. But it has very poor insulation qualities unless you're using almost prohibitively expensive glass. Okay, so normal glass, not crazy expensive, but has issues. There are tempered glasses, thicker glasses, glazed glasses, all sorts of different UV light and light level control that you can put into glass, but it becomes prohibitively expensive if you're trying to be profitable in production. Now, If you just want a hobby greenhouse and you got the money to do it, go for it, right? It's gorgeous, they're wonderful, but there's a lot of limitations on it from a cost standpoint. Now, the majority of greenhouses that are going in these days are retractable roof greenhouses. It's typically a combination of retractable roof and ridge and furrow or flat top, but in this configuration where it's shared, right? It's a bunch of shared walls with really expansive growing areas within it. The advantage to this is that the roofs can be opened entirely and closed entirely to be able to take advantage of good growing days, but then cover these structures in poor growing conditions. Low cost was really just like the ridge and furrow systems. It's to provide that extra growing space or that large growing space within it. Really good for growing bedding plants, perennials, and field-grown cut flowers. These actually do a great job of helping plants to become acclimated to going outdoors. So if you're growing plants in a greenhouse, you're starting them in a greenhouse, and these plants will eventually end up out in the landscape. You're just utilizing the greenhouse to maximize production and not rely on good weather to be able to get these plants into production and out there into the landscape. Typically, you need a hardening off period once they're let out of the greenhouse, right? Once they've been grown to a point where they can handle the outside elements. Typically, you need a period where you bring them out into a little bit of a shadier environment to harden them off and allow them to become acclimated to the general geographical climate before they go out into full sun. Now, in order to do that, you physically have to move the plants unless you have a retractable roof. If you got a retractable roof, you leave the plants in place and you open up that structure. Now, it's a lot less expensive to open up the structure if you have that ability than it is to pay a workforce to move the plants out. The other thing that happens with that moving process is there's potential for damage to those plants. Obviously, better ventilation, reduced irrigation, and more effective temperature control. The reduced irrigation comes from the fact that if it's raining and you have a non-retractable roof greenhouse, a static roof greenhouse, then the rain, that precipitation, cannot effectively irrigate those crops. If the weather is right for it from a temperature standpoint and rain is coming, then you can open up those roofs and allow the rain, that precipitation, to irrigate the crop, which reduce your water costs. Different types of retractable roofs. There's flat roof houses. These are nice for shade and frost protection. This one that we see here is a ridge and furrow system. Okay, you can see the peaks there. You can see that ridge beam up there. So that is the peaked roof designed for snow loads and keeping out rain. Sawtooth allows for venting when other parts are closed. And then there's poly retractable. Sections are withdrawn and folded up by electric motors and can be opened and closed in minutes. Okay. Different types of retractable roofs. Important thing to know, though, is that you can design greenhouses with retractable roofs. In fact, newer greenhouses that I've seen go up, large-scale greenhouses that I've seen go up in the region, have primarily all been flat roof, retractable. Now, if you consider our region is the Sacramento area, and we never get snow, right? So snow load is not an issue. So I know Matsuda's within the last about 5, 6, 7 years put in a large scale Matsuda's, put in a large flat roof system. And then I've noticed one along 80, like driving along 80. I've noticed, I don't know what the facility is, but it is, I'm not even sure what they're growing, but there's one along 80 on the north side of 80 that is a flat roof retractable. So climate control in these things. And really we're looking at heating and cooling, and then we'll look at humidification. So looking at ways that we can heat and cool greenhouses. The advantages to it is that it provides growers with power to control the temperature, water, humidity, etc. These environmental controls and we use devices that automatically turn on greenhouse systems. So there's the actual elements, the actual mechanisms that will heat and cool and add humidity to our greenhouses, and they can be controlled via very complex automation systems from a remote location, or they can very simply be controlled using on-off and thermostat control at the greenhouse. Of course, the centrally controlled, heavily automated and computerized, way more expensive, but less expensive to operate. The more analog systems are less expensive, certainly to invest in, but more expensive to manage because you need to be there to turn these things on and off at the critical times. So thermostats, there's a couple different kinds. There's on-off thermostats and then proportioning thermostats. So of course the on-off are low cost, the proportioning are a little bit more expensive. And essentially the on-off, it's a really simple system that you set an on period. If you need to heat the greenhouse, you just have a thermostat and a sensor in there that says, as soon as the temperature dips below 68 degrees, we need to turn on that heater until we get it up to 78 degrees. And then it will cool down until it hits 68 again, and then it will kick back on, and then cool, same thing repeatedly. Proportioning thermostats do a little bit better job of that. So instead of having a system where it's on at a low temp and off at a high temp, it will maintain it within a certain temperature or at a specific temperature. It's more expensive to do it because generally you're running things for longer, but those are the items that you need to kind of weigh out in order to make the decision. So those computer controls, these are central controls with a lot of sensors, and you end up being able to monitor and adjust what's happening either automatically. You can set parameters that say that I need my humidity level at 75% and I need my temperature to be held at 75 degrees. And the automated system will adjust for that. And there's always a manager that's involved that will get alerts if there's something wrong, and then they can go deal with it. So they're very complex. They use microprocessors. They're expensive, but for ongoing operation, this is a much less expensive thing to operate. High capital investment, low maintenance costs. Expensive but very accurate. They offer the greatest range of uses. All pieces of the equipment can be controlled at the same time and can be programmed to provide different zones in the greenhouse with different climate conditions. Okay, so a lot of flexibility with it. Now, heating systems. There's a couple different ways to heat greenhouses. There's hot water systems. This is where water is heated in some sort of boiler, and then it's pumped out through pipes that are either in beds themselves, like in an at-grade soil bed, or they're piped through tubes on a table that the plants sit on. And so it keeps the roots warmer. You can also pump it up and over, like in the overhead area of the greenhouse, And the intent on this is to allow that heated air around the piping that carries the hot water. It allows that heat to settle down to those plants. It's relatively low maintenance, and heat is delivered pretty evenly throughout the system as long as it's designed well. And if you're going to do a system like this, you need to think through the design of it so that you don't end up with the very last bed being freezing cold, right? You can also do steam heat. This is a standard method for heating in cut flower operations, because a lot of times cut flower operations, you want higher humidity. You have a large boiler that brings water to a hot point and produces steam that flows through pipes in the greenhouses. So it's a different method of getting some piping systems really hot. It's not as uniform as hot water systems and not as easy to adjust the temperature. But the nice thing is you can double time this machine that you're using to create the steam to be able to sterilize growing media. So anytime that you can use the same invested in machine to perform multiple tasks, you're saving money. There's the most typical one, the one that we have at ARC greenhouses and other greenhouses that you see, lots of greenhouses use this system, are unit heaters or hot air heaters. Okay, and this is the picture that you see here. Air is heated in a unit, then blown through the house. This is less expensive to install than hot water systems. The hot water systems can be expensive because you need piping that runs throughout the greenhouse in order to deliver the heat from the steam or from the hot water. So that portion is really expensive. You need that boiler as well. With the unit heaters, what you end up with is that you have the purchase price of the heater, but then you're either blowing that through the greenhouse, or what's most typically done is that you have a polyethylene tube, a plastic tube with a bunch of holes in it, that when the heater blows air, it's blowing air through this tube, and the hot air comes out of those holes and heats the greenhouse from the top, right? So it's an inexpensive way to heat the greenhouse, far less expensive than the piping and tubing systems that would be needed for the boiler or steam systems. And with it, you end up with more dry air. And so this typically is associated with lower instances of fungal or botrytis diseases. Now, you do have fuel costs, right? Because you got to be able to pump propane or natural gas into this. And that is an expense. However, like the flip side of that is, as you're burning that fuel, the product is carbon dioxide. And we learned in photosynthesis that carbon dioxide is a part of photosynthesis. Those stomates are taking air in, and it's taking carbon dioxide in. And so a lot of times it's considered beneficial for the plants to be in higher carbon dioxide environments. There's also infrared heating systems and energy curtains. So these automated systems, a lot of automated systems utilize certain types of fabrics that insulate greenhouses at night, right? So when it gets dark, they can roll out these energy curtains, and it will insulate that crop at night, which will reduce your heating costs. You can also utilize these. You can see that typically these energy curtains are somewhat translucent, so you can use them to shade crops during the day. They're installed from gutter to gutter and are 8 to 12 feet above the ground. So in those ridge and furrow systems, they span from gutter to center or gutter to gutter, depending on what the structure itself is. Means that you need the room up there to be able to slide that over. And computerized systems open and close these curtains based on preset light levels or temps. So those computerized systems will have light sensors within it, and it will adjust those as needed. It can be done manually as well, but again, that is an excessive, it's a high amount of labor, and that is skilled, typically a more skilled labor, which is more expensive. Curtains can lower daytime temperatures 8 to 10 degrees lower than full sun, reducing stress on plants and lower water and fertilizer needs. At night, closed curtains trap in energy and saves 25 to 35% in heating and fuel costs. And then the other advantage to this is you can use these systems for short day. Okay, so when we're talking about certain plants, there's certain plants that are phototropic. Phototropic plants have certain plant functions induced at certain amounts of light, and typically they're day period inductions. So a phototropic plant will flower, let's say it'll be in vegetative growth during periods of the year where it's getting more than 10 hours of sunlight per day. And as the period of year gets closer and closer to the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year in terms of duration of sunlight, those plants become induced to flower or change color. Example being poinsettias. Poinsettias, we talked about the poinsettia itself being that it's a foliage display, right? The poinsettias get that amazing foliage color, whether it's a red or a pink or a yellow or a variegated or whatever it is. It gets those colors at a certain time of the year. Well, in California, the daylight hours, the way that it breaks down is that they don't turn red or change, those modified leaves don't turn red or change color just before the holiday season, just before, December and into late December. And so when you get poinsettias during the holiday season, because it's a very typical holiday plant, the reason that they're red is because the daylight hours have been restricted. So these are grown in greenhouses, and the way that they induce that red color is that they shade them. They essentially trick the plants into thinking that it's a shorter day period, shorter sunlight period, and that's when they'll turn red. Okay, so these systems that utilize energy curtains, you can also incorporate shade curtains for short day so that you can grow specific crops like poinsettia, chrysanthemum, and kalanchoe. The way that you do this is you're not using these semi-translucent energy curtains. You're using black poly or aluminum and poly combos, okay? So that you're completely shading those things out, getting them to think that they are in nighttime. Now, cooling and ventilation systems, the typical cooling and vent systems is a fan and pad system. This one is the most typically used, and this is a diagram of how it works. So you have a pad system on one side, and you have a fan system on the other side. The fan system blows air out of the greenhouse, which in turn pulls air in through the pad. This is what the pads look like, and this is what the fans look like. The pads themselves have a water system that it pumps water up to the top of the pad, and that water trickles down uniformly through the pad. When the fans kick on and draw air out of the greenhouse, it pulls warm air through the wet pads and it cools that air, pulling in more humid, more cool air into the greenhouse itself. Now you see a couple different things here. You see this sort of vent looking system. This allows for ventilation, but it also allows so that when during the cooler months, when you don't want to allow warmer air within the greenhouse outside of the greenhouse, these vents close down the pads so that you lose less hot air. And then here you see these fans. When these fans are in operation, these louvers are blown open so that the air can pass out. But when they're not in operation, the louvers close up so that it retains as much heat as possible. Here you see fog systems or mist systems. You see these used a lot. So this top picture is a fog or mist system. You see these used a lot in outdoor environments, right? So certainly in the Sacramento region, you go out to an outdoor eating area in the heat of summertime, and you're going to see a fog or a misting system. They use these the same way in greenhouses to be able to cool the air, because you kick up that humidity, you get those water particles in, and you need an atomizer that produces water vapor. The water vapor cools the house by flash evaporation, increasing humidity while they cool. The lower temp ends up throughout the greenhouse and is used typically in southern states. You also have simple vents, and we've gone through it. You've seen a couple vents already in this presentation. So simple vents, you got a ridge vent that allows hot air out, and then you also have some side venting as well. In the slide deck that I've posted, you can click on these links, and these are links to different professional suppliers. At ARC, we've dealt with Agritech a bunch. These companies are great. They build greenhouses, and they work with people who want to build greenhouses. And so they work with you on your location, your crop, and what the needs of that crop might be. And they work with you on your budget. So utilizing these professionals is a great move in order to plan out any kind of greenhouse installation. This picture right here is actually a picture of a sort of a greenhouse, shade house, hoop house combination that is at, I'm not sure if it's still there. I don't think it is actually, because they changed it. But this is the one that I utilized in college when I was going to school. And this is a mother stock area. Okay, so if you're thinking like, hey, you might be into some plant production on a smaller scale, this is a great setup for that. There's an area here for mother stock that's planted in 15-gallon pots, irrigated with drip irrigation, just set on coarse mulch. And this is where cuttings can be taken to be able to root in those cuttings, and those would be rooted in this portion of the greenhouse structure, which has fiberglass at the front and back of it. And then it has polyethylene sheeting, a double polyethylene sheeting with side venting. And this is a more controlled environment where those cuttings can root in a more controlled environment. Typically after rooting in, they're brought into this saran hoop house. This material is a shading cloth. And they're brought into this to be put into 4-inch pots or 1-gallon size pots. And they're left in here to harden off. After that, they're brought out into full sunlight to be able to root out into a condition that's a sellable condition, right? So you can see that you can do an incredible amount of production in a pretty small amount of space. As long as you're creative, you think it through, and you can set yourself up a pretty darn good system. So that's it on climate control and what we do from a greenhouse standpoint and a climate control standpoint in order to produce plants for profit.